There's a wonderful story, maybe you've heard it along the way somewhere, about the Jew who moved into a Catholic neighborhood. And of course, they're not supposed to have red meat on Friday, but every Friday he would have a barbecue in the backyard. And so he would have his barbecue, and all the neighbors would be sort of getting hungry. So they came to him and they said, why don't you convert to our church? So, okay, we took him down to the bishop, and anyway, the old story goes that the bishop waved the holy water over him and said, born a Jew, raised a Jew, now a Catholic. Well, they thought this would be no problem anymore. The next Friday, here he was barbecuing again. So they all came running, and they looked around the corner of his house, and here he was in the backyard with his steak, and he was waving the barbecue sauce over it, and he said, born a cow, raised a cow, now a fish. So conversion. But I have used that story around the world to say nobody should convert in that way. Just magic, just waving magic wand. People convert because they believe that something that they got next was better than what they had before. Better picture of God. Some answers that are more comprehensive, that take in more of the data. And so we want to talk about how we feel our God is. This picture of God is better than the alternatives and better than what we believed before. It certainly was for me. The old story that Bill Hybels, pastor of Willow Creek, used to say, the young man that had not converted after years of witnessing, they'd go windsurfing together. And the young man finally said, you know, I've always been afraid that I would lose more than I would gain. See, the only reason people convert is if they think they will gain more than they will lose. So I hope that you'll hear that picture of God today on Flame of Truth. Just to tell you a little sort of modern version of this Bible story. There was a young girl down in our part of Southern California who, as she got into her teenage years, I have teenage boys, you can imagine a teenage girl, she began to have some issues, starting to become her own person. She wanted to differentiate between her and her parents. There began to be the conflict of wills and fighting over music, fighting over her skirts, fighting over how she looked, and homework and all the rest. So finally, she had a big fight with her mother and parents and finally ran away from home. Jumped on a bus, went up to San Francisco. Well, she got off the bus, she didn't have much money, and she's walking along the road, has a little short skirt on. And a guy in a big car stops by, rolls down the window and said, hey, you need some food, you want a dinner? She was hungry, yeah. Got in the car, you can guess what happened. Pretty soon, she is a teenage prostitute, living where the pimps take care of her. So she lived a high life for a while. He began to give her some pills that made her feel wonderful. And she was getting some money, not all the money, of course, but some, until she got sick. And she got a bad disease. And what are you going to do? Well, now she wasn't any good to them anymore. They put her on the street. She's walking the street. She's hungry. She's sick. She's sleeping wherever there's a warm grate on the road. And finally she said, maybe this wasn't such a good idea. You know, even with all the fighting at home, maybe that's better than where I am now. So she gets on the phone and leaves a message for her parents. She says, I'm going to get on a bus. I'm going to come back down to home. If you're at the bus terminal about 11:30, then I'll know that it's okay and I'll come home. If no one's there, I'll understand and I'll just keep on going and no problem. So she hung up, she got on the bus, she began to head for home. And the story goes that as she got closer and closer, 6-7 hours, finally she's getting closer and closer to Los Angeles. She begins to wonder, will anyone be there? She begins to primp herself, she begins to put her hair together and try to get herself smoothed out and as best she could. Wondering if anyone will be there. She finally gets to the bus terminal and she gets her bag and she begins to come off the bus, wondering, will anyone be there? Here they all are. Here's a big banner over the whole group. Welcome home, honey, and balloons and everybody. There wasn't just her mother or father. There was everybody, all the grandparents, cousins, aunts, and uncles. The whole 40, 50 people were there to say, welcome home, honey. And here they were, came running to her. She saw her dad, and she begins to cry, and she begins to make a little speech. Dad, I'm so sorry. We have time for that later. Never mind, never mind. We're just glad you're home. And they go home to the party. Well, I'm sure it doesn't take much to figure out that that's a modern version that Philip Yancey uses in his book about grace and the prodigal son. Luke chapter 15. So let's look at this story of the story. The young man wants to go. Why would he want to leave when he has it all at the Father's house? But he wants independence. He wants to be on his own. That's always what sin is. Sin is not necessarily committing a certain series of acts against the law first. First of all, it is saying, I think I can have a better life away from my Father's house than here. It starts there with a lack of trust about the goodness of the Father and where you are. Sin is relational. Sin is when you leave your Father's house. Righteousness is when you go back. But what do we learn about the Father with this story? A young person always wants to go, thinks it'll be better somewhere. I had a young man when I was giving Bible studies as a young youth pastor 30 years ago, Portland, Oregon. And all of a sudden I went to the house one day and he wasn't there. And I said, where'd he go? His mother said he wanted to be free. He's tired of all the rules. And so he wanted to run away. I said, where'd he go? Join the Marines. I said he thought he would get an easier life with the Marines. So we think that there's always a better life in the world somewhere. Well, God, the Father lets him go. So what do we learn about God? Father is rich. God is rich. Father has a house. Our Father has a house. He says, my Father's house are many mansions. But for some reason, if you want to go, God will let you go. God will never get in the way. If you want to be somewhere else, God will fight it. He'll resist it for a while, but eventually he will say, okay, if that's what you want to do. God is a God absolutely committed to free choice. Funny little story someone gave me years ago from New York City. A man went down to Puerto Rico to do some business. Got in the taxi and took off. They got to the first street, a red light. Taxi went right through. He said, why'd you do that? And the taxi driver, well, that's how my brother taught me. Came to the next red light, rode through that one again. He said, why'd you do that? This is how my brother taught me to drive. Well, don't do it. We're going to die. Came to the next light. It was green. Then the man stopped. And he said, now it's green. You can go. No, he said, my brother might be coming. And that's what God is. God will stop. You want to go? God will say, okay. He always wants to say, whatever you want, I will give you free choice. People want to know why bad things happen in the world. If God has the power to stop it, why doesn't he use it? Why does he allow children to suffer and tsunamis? And we have fires all over our California today as I am taping this. There's always people with cancer. I have a big church, people with cancer, people dying. Oh, why does God allow it? Because God is committed to free choice. My father was killed 5 years ago. A terrible accident. He was walking on the sidewalk. 72 years old, perfect health. Someone came along in a truck and ran him over. Flew through the air, died that night. The next day or two, the word began to get out. Been a pastor for 50 years, and someone who knew him well called me, Pastor Dan, where's the hedge? There's supposed to be a hedge around people who are committed to God, who live a careful, holy life. Always ate right, kept the commandments, paid tithe, was a minister for God. Where was the hedge? But God has to, if he's going to let the good people have free choice, he has to let the bad people have free choice too. And God has to be careful that we would maybe go for him for the wrong reasons. My brothers and I stood around a bed in the hospital right here in Riverside. And we watched as the heart monitor went down, heartbeat by heartbeat. And finally, it was 0. But let's just say a Buddhist priest had walked in at that moment. We grew up in Thailand, and let's say a Buddhist priest in the orange saffron robes comes walking in. And he says, can I help you? Yeah, well, our father just died. He said, let me pray. and he begins to pray a Buddhist prayer and does whatever they say, little mantra. And all of a sudden, that little heart monitor begins to kick again. And all of a sudden, my father begins to breathe, and my father wakes up and says, "What happened?" And he pulls the tubes out, and he stands up, and we go home together. My brothers and I would all be Buddhists the next day. How could you ignore it if that God comes through more than the God I had before? So God has to be very careful that not persuade people to want to love him and believe him against their free will by giving them so many miracles and taking care of all the evil. If every time someone got baptized, they got a brand new red Ferrari sports car, the whole world would get baptized, but for the wrong reasons. God wants people to love him for who he is. So people want to leave. I hope you don't go. I don't think you'll like where you're going, but you can go. And so he moves out. He goes down, this Bible says, to a far country. Luke 15, verse 13. Went to the far country and began to spend all his money, began to have girls, women, drugs, drinking, you know, the party lifestyle. And you may think this doesn't apply to me, doesn't apply to you. You keep the commandments, you're a good person, you go to church. I don't know. But as one writer says, you don't have to go to a far country to be in a far country. You can be sitting right in church, but be very far from the Father's house. There's an old cute story, and maybe I've told it here, don't know, about the people who went to heaven and all the clocks. And you remember the story where there was a clock for everyone. Some clock slow, some clock fast. And every time they sinned, the clock moved a little bit. So it goes slow, people are not sinning much, clocks went faster a little more. But the point is, every single clock is moving. The Bible says, Romans 3:23, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Every one of us is a prodigal at some way, some level. We may be able to keep it out in front. No one knows, but there's a prodigal part of us inside in our heart. So we've all gone to a far country. Well, you know the story. About that time, the money ran out, and the famine swept over the land. You may not have experienced this yet, but if you haven't, you will. If you try to fulfill your life with the world's parties, the parties will always run out. It may feel good for a while. You may think, let's go shopping. And we cruise the mall, and you get something new, and it's off. If I could just have that, I'll feel good for a long time. Buy a new camera, get a computer, buy a new dress, get a new hairstyle. If I could just buy that house on the hill, if I could just have my house paid for, if I could just get that degree so I could write those letters at the back of my name. I live on a campus where 2 or 3 times a year we get to all wear our academic regalia. If I could just have a PhD and people call me doctor, I'll be happy. And then you find out that somehow the newness wears off, and the new house or the new car or the degree somehow does not heal that inner gap and longing and hole, emptiness inside our soul. And the prodigal son finally woke up and realized that the party was over. The basketball fan, followed Magic Johnson for years, grew up in a Christian home, but ended up getting tall and wandering away, playing for Michigan State, won a national championship, Los Angeles Lakers, won 5 world championships, but he lived a crazy bachelor lifestyle. It's all in a book. You don't have to hear it from me. Women in every city. He lived all his fantasies. Someone came to him, knew he had a fiancée and girlfriend back in Lansing, Michigan, where he grew up, waiting for him. And she knew how he was living. She said, how can you grew up in a Christian home, how can you live like this? Girl's waiting for you. And he said, well, I'm young, I've got money, this is what I'm going to do for now. God and the girl will have to wait. I'll get back to them later. Well, in the meantime, he got HIV. Now he's blessed because he got HIV at a time when there's retroviral drugs and he can stay alive maybe. But he said, it wasn't worth it. I had every fantasy. I did all I wanted to do, but it wasn't worth it. The party will always run out eventually. So he says he persuaded a local farmer to let him take care of the pigs. So now he's sitting there with the pigs, and there's a wonderful theological point here. The father didn't send him to the pigs. The father didn't somehow punish him. You spent all my money. You've been out there with the girls. You've embarrassed me. You've defamed my name. Now I'm going to say, no, it's a natural consequence. You leave the father's house, you will eventually end up in the pigs, or some modern version of that. Somewhere away of who you were meant to be, of what God designed you to be, what kind of life God wants you to have. You will end up with the pigs. So he is sitting there with the pigs and saying, how did I end up here? It is what the debate was there in the Garden of Eden thousands of years ago. God said, if you eat of the tree, you will surely die. And the serpent in the tree says, no, did God really say if you eat of the tree, you would surely die? No, you will not surely die. You'll be as gods. And God and Satan have these two. That's the issue in the great controversy we talk about, this battle between God and Satan that the whole universe is about. Who is telling the truth? God says, if you leave my house, you will end up with the pigs. The other side says, no, if you leave the Father's house, you'll be better off. You'll be free. You'll be independent. You'll be able to live. You don't need God to live. In the prodigal son's story, Jesus came down to tell, says, you will end up with the pigs. I won't put you there. It's not what I do. But you choose to live apart from me. This is what happened. You will surely die. Maybe you remember a story that Mark Knoll told when he was a writer for the Inside magazine about a young man who fell in love with a young woman. And they had a castle. He was going to let her live in the castle. She was ready to say yes. He said, no, let me show you the grave, remember, in the back. And who was this? My first wife. She began to draw away from me. I did everything I could to win her and hold on to her, but I finally had to kill her. And now, honey, will you marry me? Will you love me? You remember the story. And that's the dilemma. We're all wrestling with our picture of God. Is God the kind of God who says, love me, or I will kill you? Love me, or I'll put you with the pigs. Love me, or I'll send you to hell. Love me, or I'll put you in purgatory. Is this the kind of God God is? And we're trying to say to you with this particular program, God isn't that kind of God. That is not the way God is. Sin leads to natural consequences. The wages of sin are death. A man reaps what he sows. Well, you can go on to the rest of the story. It says the young man came to his senses. He began to think. Even the workmen in my father's house are better than this. They get 3 square meals a day. And here I am eating with the pigs. Maybe I should go home. Maybe my father will let me be a servant in my father's house. It is always the Holy Spirit who plants that idea. We were made for heaven. Ecclesiastes 3:11 says, God has placed eternity in your heart. We are always made for a heavenly home. We're not to get too comfortable here. We're just passing through. That's our real home. And the prodigal son said, maybe I made a mistake to leave my father's house. And so begins to head back home. He plans a little speech that when he gets home, he will say to his father, you know, I've sinned against you and all of that. So he heads home. Charles Swindoll has another version of this little story. He says the boy gets home. He knocks on the door. He's hoping that they'll welcome him home, but there's no answer. Nobody answers the door. He goes around the house. He looks in all the windows. He can see the family eating at the dining room table. He goes on around and looks in the window of his room, and they've taken his room away. It's not his room anymore. There's a billiard table and other things, and they don't have a place for him anymore. He goes back to the front door and he cries out, I'm home, I'm home, I'm here. Father cries out, we don't know who you are. You have nothing to do with us. I'm not your father anymore. You've embarrassed us. You've defamed us. Now just go away. We want nothing more to do with you. And in Swindoll's story, the young man goes back to the bridge of the last river and jumps and commits suicide. No, that is not the version of the story in the Bible. God is not like that. When the young man comes home and says the father was watching and he saw him from afar off and the father ran, no Middle Eastern man would run. Great men do not run. You wait for people to come to you, but this father ran. He wanted to see his son, and he gathers his arms around his son. The son begins to give the speech. Father, I'm so sorry. I should never have left. Look what I've done. Father said, never mind. And he calls for the servant, bring the robe, bring the family ring, bring some shoes, and let's have a party, kill a calf. My son is home. He was dead and he's alive. He's been found. And here we have the heart of the gospel, is that you can always go home again. Doesn't matter what you've done. Doesn't matter where you've been. Doesn't matter what you have wasted of your life in the past. Don't waste any more. You can always go home. The light will always be on. The Father's always out waiting for you. You can always go home again. The Father does not say, show me the money. Where's my money? The Father doesn't say, I want something back from you. You got to go work for a while to pay off what you've done. There is nothing, just Father just gives. He doesn't even wait for the Son to repent. The Father always accepts back first. I grew up in a Buddhist country where if you want to get right with God, you have to give sacrifices. You have to go out early in the morning at 5. I've seen them in serving the priests rice, trying to build up merit. Or you buy some birds and let them go free. You have to do something in order to get the gods to bless you. That's the gospel in that religion. I grew up, went to high school in Singapore, Hindu religion, where they would have what they call taipusam. You've sinned. Once a year, you'd have to take this ceremony, but stick the spears through your skin. And they would have maybe 100 spears through the neck and nose and everywhere. I've watched them do it with like chanting and smoke and incense. And they would go down the streets for miles trying to pay for their sins. The Pope one time made the emperor stand barefoot out in the snow, Kanasa, because he would not forgive him for what he had done, make him pay for it. Our God is not like that. And Jesus came down from heaven to tell this story. Maybe this story is the defining story about the character of God, that God is the kind of God you can always go home again. He will always open the door and say, I'm just glad you're home. God is a God of grace from beginning to end. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. God says, I change not. I was speaking about this one night in India years ago, one of our schools. Long line of people to talk to me afterwards. I've been there all week. Finally, after everyone was gone, one left. Didn't want anyone else to hear this story. I won't tell a lot of detail. Was going to be a pastor, and I had a girl. He said, I thought we were going to get married, never made any mistakes. Then she broke up, and I was devastated. And in my loneliness, another girl came in, took advantage, and began to sort of draw me in, and she took me to another room, and we did something that I had not planned to do until we got married. And now I'm afraid I have a disease. I've sinned against God. Is God going to let me come back? You said, God, you can always go home again, that there was always forgiveness. Can God forgive me? And is there room in the church? Can I still work for God with this mistake? And I just put my hands on his shoulders and looked in his eyes and said, you can always go home again. There's always room for you. And I think he's a pastor today. Made a mistake. I said, go and sin no more. But God is a God of grace and forgiveness. You can always go home again. Well, one last point here I think we need to point out. They had a party for the prodigal son. Older brother didn't like it, but there was a party. I pastor on a campus, and I've spoken for college campuses around the world. There's always this fear that if you get too close to God, if you begin to live a godly life, all the fun will be gone. And that you kind of have to live through a deprived life if you're going to be a fully devoted follower of Christ. And God will only make it up to you when you get to heaven. Then that's when the party comes. But while you're down here, you have to give up the party to wait for the heavenly party. And we're always just saying, just be patient and God will do it. No, that is not the story of the Bible. There are two parties in this story. There is the prodigal son party out there in the far country, but there's also the party at the Father's house. There's two parties. You just have to choose which party you want to be in. One party will come to an end. One party will go forever. One party is out with the prostitutes and the crazy people at the far country. One party is with the Father and all the people who are in the Father's house. And that party will last forever. You choose your party. Which party do you want to be a part of? You not have to choose between a party and no party. It's choosing which party you want to be in. Party, small p, capital P party. Well, we're coming to an end here. I'll tell you a couple little stories to be done. There was a wonderful old Chinese legend from thousands of years ago. There was a father and mother. They had some older children, some younger children, big two-story house. House burst into flame. We've got fires everywhere today. Scary. My brother just had to evacuate and go stay in a motel. All of a sudden, they were horrified to look upstairs and realize that the little children were still up there. They didn't see the fire. So they yelled at the little children, jump, the house is on fire. No, they didn't see any fire. We're playing with our beautiful toys. We don't want to jump. Father cried out again, come on, you've got to jump. No, we don't want to jump. We're playing with our toys. And then they said that the father finally cried out, if you will just jump, Daddy will buy you bigger toys, better toys, more wonderful toys. Just jump. Then the kids jumped. We will not get the world to accept God because of scaring them about the fire. We will only get the world to jump to God if we can show that our God is a better God who has bigger toys, better toys, more wonderful toys. 1 Corinthians 2, verse 9, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for us. I think we have time for one last little story. If you haven't heard this before, the story about John Hartman, a soldier. Civil War in our country, 1860, 1863, I think, between North and South, families fighting. Terrible, terrible battles, piles of bodies everywhere, the 50,000 sick and dead and wounded. And they say about sundown, an old father with his lantern was out looking for his son, John Hartman. And he would cry out, "John Hartman, are you here?" And then he would listen to see if the son would respond. He knew his son was here somewhere, his old man. He was a Quaker, so he would say, "Thee and thou, John Hartman, thy father is calling thee." And he would listen. Some guys got mad. "Come on, old man, go away." Someone else said, "Boy, I wish it was my father." He cried again, John Hartman, thy father's calling thee." And he would listen, running with a lantern. All of a sudden, he heard a voice. The young boy said, "Father, I'm over here. I'm still alive. Come." And the father went, threw all the bodies off, grabbed his son, and took him home. What's the point of the story? That father didn't care what side his son was on, didn't care who won the battle. All they cared about was getting his son home. Home. Your name may not be John Hartman today, but there's still a heavenly Father who is going all over the world, over the battlefield of our world, calling for his son and daughters to come home. And if you've been away in the far country, I just invite you to come home, where the light is always on. You can always go home again, and you will find a Father who is calling you home and who will have a party that will never end. I invite you to be part of that party and be with him forever.